All right. Welcome back to another freshly squeezed episode of PKs on Air. Very much looking forward to this one's episode because there has been tons of things going on in the almost 5 weeks now. It's gonna be only me today, so I'm your host. I'm Bastian, as most of you probably have figured by now. Dominique is on her kind of well-deserved, I think, vacation. It's a bit lonely, I have to admit, but hey, more time to cover a lot of things, which is certainly needed. Looking at my the crazy amount of tabs that I kind of prepared for you guys to kind of go through. Yeah, we're gonna be having our usual kind of weekly and monthly update on all things that happened in search, in organic search specifically. A couple of quick housekeeping things before we get going. Kind of the show notes, as always, pa.ag/notes. This is where you can find them. It's supposed to look something like this once you're going, and then we have like an overview of all the kind of recent episodes with kind of a lot of kind of in detail kind of stuff. You have the videos. You have kind of a write-up on a lot of things, actually. We had some fantastic guests last week, including Mike King, Cindy Crum, and our very own Julia, Dominique, etc. So it was a really cool round. We kind of went into a lot of different things, a lot of stuff that kind of we thought is gonna worthwhile sharing, that we think is gonna happen in organic as well as paid search, actually. And yeah, so this week we're gonna go through a ton of things that happened in the last weeks. It was actually quite a lot. I have to say, I'm not gonna lie. I went back through some of my notes. Also, a huge shout out to our good friend Eleda, who does a phenomenal job curating news with her SEO newsletter. So if you're not already kind of a subscriber, then that's definitely worth doing so. So yeah, and if you want to kind of chat along, we should be live on the usual platforms. Kind of happy to take your questions, comments, whatever, in between. And yeah, I'm going to go through a couple of things that I found quite fascinating, interesting, worth sharing, etc. So without further ado, I would say we just kind of get cracking. There is I need to kind of probably zoom in a bit. Yes. So Itamar Blauer did, that was already early March, so might be a bit old news for some of you, but let me see if I can make it a bit bigger, actually. Yeah, that maybe works better. Or can we do it that way? Yeah, that doesn't change. Okay, so that works. Anyhow, so he did a really massive guide on all things YouTube, YouTube SEO specifically. If you can see reading time 18 minutes, yeah, it's quite a big thing. And he's kind of going through a ton of things that are kind of worthwhile having a read into, like if you're doing anything around video. So kind of like brief comparison, SEO for Google, SEO for YouTube, what are the differences, on page, off page, technical stuff, traffic sources, and you can see that it goes on and on and on. Tips and tricks, like audience building, keyword research, because there's a different kind of keyword tool for this. Predictions, which we kind of somewhat know from Google as well. How you can use trends, optimizing kind of on-site stuff such as metadata for YouTube, for your channel, for example. Kind of how to kind of use categories and whatnot to your advantage. About tabs, etc. And there's kind of talks about preview images, like how to stand out with them, and so on and so forth. So not my area of expertise, admittedly, but if you are doing anything around video, that is certainly something that you should have a look. It's definitely worth spending some time on it. By the way, I hate those overlays. Anyhow, another massive piece, and I recall we discussed a lot of those in the past, but like another really massive piece, which kind of sparked a lot of discussion, I have to say. I'm not gonna lie, I also jumped on it, and there was a bit of a kind of, should I say rant, but probably yes, that I kind of couldn't refrain from on Twitter. But basically, there's on boostroas.com, there's a kind of a article that kind of the headline says, what happens if you canonicalize e-commerce pagination pages to the first page? And the one thing that I wanna stress, and then I kind of leave it up to you. The one thing I want to stress is that this is actually not how you should be doing it, very generally speaking. Because, well, if you would be doing something like this to canonicalize to the first page, that would essentially mean that you would kind of ruin your internal linking, because if your canonical tag from page 2 points to a page 1, then obviously you kind of cut those products being listed on page 2 and the following out of the link graph, and that means, well, they might not get proper internal link equity. I feel honestly that this has been discussed a lot in the past, and there's not really many new things kind of to be shared. But yeah, it seems to be a kind of continuous topic for debate, and Roman did a huge write-up and like explaining what he did, and kind of observing what he tested, etc., etc. So have a look, but please understand that it's not according to what you would normally do, and I somewhat do not really agree with the conclusion in terms of utilizing crawl budget. I think there's a lot more considerations around that, and if you would do it, I think you should really understand why and how. So, but yeah, it's worth reading it because it's an interesting test in itself. Generally, we would not recommend doing that. There's another thing that kind of ties in quite nicely, that has been released by the Google team in person of Daniel Weisberg, who is a search advocate and mainly works on the Search Console, giving a bit of an insight on like the crawl budget as well as the kind of revamped crawl stats report. If you recall, we kind of covered this, I think it was in the episode prior. So we briefly introduced some of the changes that Google made. And so it kind of comes back with like a bit of a special episode on like some training around that, because, well, things obviously changed. 10 minutes, it's a quick thing for everyone, but probably if you're not familiar with the most recent changes, then that's certainly worth watching. So yeah, crawl budget and crawl stats report in form of a YouTube video. Another massive piece that Patrick Stocks released. Patrick now works, well, not now, but for a while already works for Ahrefs, which, for those that kind of are not familiar with the tool, kind of have one of the hugest, biggest, largest index of backlink database, like backlinks for off-page work. And so he went into a topic that, again, often sparks a bit of like, well, let's say debate, friendly conversation between SEOs, you could probably also call it, on kind of an evergreen topic. Subdomains versus subfolders. Is one or the other, or any of those two, actually better for your SEO efforts, right? So I think subdomains you're certainly familiar with from for example, Wikipedia. Subfolders is something obviously kind of that sits on the main domain, and then as shown here is, well, there's a nice guide on this, but yeah, so you have the subdomain and you have the subfolder subtopic, and Patrick tries to kind of go into like, what is best for SEO, case studies, as well as kind of some reasons and ideas as to what the results and how the results look like. It's a, as I've been saying, it's a long-standing debate it's a long-standing, somewhat argument. And back in the day, and it's quite cool that he actually kind of dug this one out. Matt Cutts at the time, kind of still being the kind of major spokesperson, if you so will, for Google, and that was in 2012, said they're roughly equivalent. And he'd said kind of I would go, for whichever is easier for you, depending on your system, depending on your setup. Both are on the same domain overall. So it's really a question of, what is easier for you. And then John Muller kind of backed this up 5 years later, saying, well, it's fine if you use either or, it doesn't really matter. Make changes to a site's UI structure tends to take a bit of time. We all know that, right? So it's mainly about recrawling, those types of things, understanding, potentially passing on signals if you had let's say redirects implemented or something like this. So yeah, it just kind of might take a bit for Google to understand the setup, but it doesn't really matter which setup that actually is. And there's some kind of arguments back and forth. I kind of stay with that. And so one thing that Patrick picked up on is that, he says many SEOs believe that subdomains are treated as separate domains, but the truth is more complicated. Anyone that incorporates subdomains as the main part of their site will likely have them treated the exact same as a subfolder would be treated. However, if you're not treating the subdomain as part of your main website, so they're not connected, that's an important point here that Patrick makes, reading as not connecting them with internal links, then they may be treated as separate. And I think this makes actually quite a lot of sense, right? So if you, of course, have something sitting on a subdomain, and by the way, keep in mind that www.domain.com is also, www is a subdomain, right? It's nothing different from blog. Or magazine. Or, www2. It's technically, it's just a subdomain as well, right? So, so Patrick kind of makes the same case and kind of is referring to the fact that obviously it's very important that those are well internally linked. There's a huge case from Disney in this case, where he kind of dug into it and is kind of trying to come up with, reasons and kind of ideas behind the concept. So quite interesting. And also has some cases on certain migrations from one structure to the other, right? So github.com blog to blog github.com to github.blog, which if you look at the organic traffic chart here, if you kind of take the spikes, it's roughly the same, right? So there's there's not really an argument to be had here, because it's by that it looks almost the same. Of course, he's also trying to kind of go into what I just kind of already mentioned, right? So signal changes, how long does Google need to pick up certain things, etc., etc. So it's a really good and strong read. So and Patrick's final thought, and I'm just kind of going to read it to you, is you might want to think twice before changing from a subdomain to a subfolder if the only reason this is doing it for SEO. I think you could be even more broad in this case. If there's any changes that you only do for SEO, I would say then that might be already kind of the wrong approach here. But also I think, and that's just kind of coming down to our experiences, that naturally, subfolders tend to work better by the looks of it, simply because the fact is that they are integrated, oftentimes at least, way better into the main site. So that's the entire story, and it goes back to what Patrick has been saying. Look, if you don't integrate your subdomain, which seemed to be the case more often than if you compare it to subfolders, then that's a problem. And I agree. From perception and just observing cases and having done a lot of kind of domain migrations, oftentimes also consolidations to generic top-level domains like a .com/language folder, for example, we have seen the better performance over the board on subfolders versus subdomains. But again, it's not. It always would mean that both setups need to be kind of done correctly. It's not impossible to rank with subdomains, but personally, my preference, if it can be done, if I have a good technical setup, if I can use something even some of the arguments standing there were okay, but the subdomain, you can map that or routed to an external server. Again, this can be done with a subfolder with a proxy pass-through as well. So it doesn't really matter. Like, I think those are not really the argument. Like, it's not really the argument to be made. The argument to be made is like how and what is on that property, be it a folder, be it a subdomain. So this is, I think, probably the biggest question. And then how do you integrate it, and do you want to integrate it? You can rank with both. My personal preference is, if I can have it, I would still go for the subfolder, but happy to kind of take any fight and discussion on that. Our good friend Michael King, who joined last week, and we didn't kind of really manage to go in depth into this piece, so I thought it would be worth kind of to share it again. I'm not going to walk you through it, but what is, in Mike's opinion, one of the biggest things, or like kind of probably is causing or can cause one of the biggest kind of shakeups, is mobile-only indexing. So we spoke about it. I think we also did a kind of a session a couple of weeks back on like best practices, questions, and thoughts that we have on this topic. So I would strongly recommend you go back, kind of have a look at what Mike has to say about it. Again, I'm not necessarily fully aligned with the impact if you compare it to other big topics, but it certainly is a very important topic. Therefore, like all the stuff that Mike's writing, like, is absolutely worth reading. So go have a look. PullRank.com. I'm gonna find it. Then there is a quite interesting topic that is also worth sharing, which is oftentimes also one that I kind of see being asked a lot in my Tech SEO workshops that I do. So there's the kind of this discussion around website outages, and John Muller addressed that on Twitter, and he mentioned 503s. Just for a bit of more context, 503s, what he means is a specific HTTP status code, or HTTP response, basically, which by design kind of says, okay, look, like, this service is currently not available. Please, whoever's requesting this, come back at a later time. And Googlebot understands this and would not make any change to like what the crawler has been seeing before. So like the index would not be updated with, maybe there's something broken on the site with a kind of an error message or something. So Googlebot would just ignore that and come back at a later time, which is quite interesting. But it makes sense that they do it in a way. But like, what's quite interesting here is that you might also want to look at kind of this entire thing in kind of a bit more, how would you say, like in a bit more detail, because 503s can also be combined with what's referred to as kind of an additional HTTP header, and you could also specify a period when Googlebot is supposed to come back. So it's called revisit after. And revisit after, you could, if that there's kind of a scheduled maintenance, for example, that takes longer, let's say an hour, right? You could set this revisit after to 3,600 seconds, which equals this 1 hour. And then therefore, like, Googlebot would not start hammering, well, not necessarily hammering, but like recrawling constantly, trying to see if this 503 is actually gone. And on an additional note, what you can also do, because oftentimes, right, so this is only happening, when, like, let's say kind of, application servers maybe not responding, or your web servers potentially not responding. But oftentimes, let's say your robot's text file, which sits in the document root, right, is still working. So that would still respond with the HTTP 200, and then only like something where the app server is involved would kind of give you like a 503. So what you can do is you can also specifically serve a 503 error and for the robot's text file, and then Googlebot would understand this, and they would stop or halt like all the crawling until for the entirety of the domain, right? Not only for a certain section, etc. So they would just understand, okay, like, this is not there anymore, it doesn't work, even the robot's text is not coming back, then we should maybe stop it. And that works really, really well, especially also, like, we use a lot in large scale like migration scenarios. And then you could like serve the 503 with a revisit after of like 2 or 3 hours until you have like updated all the systems, kind of they are all responding nicely, cache is warmed up, etc., etc. And then you take it away, kind of serve the 200 again, and you'd be good to go, right? So yeah, 503 status codes is something that is definitely worth understanding on a second note to this topic, because it's actually really important. Like what we kind of tend to see is that like people do not really plan for those kind of disaster scenarios. So like, what if all of a sudden your database server is not there anymore or not responding? So one of the things that we kind of like to do when we onboard new clients is that we kind of do this and test it specifically. So like maybe you want to go kind of see what your client's server does when you do this on purpose. Maybe not at daytime, but ideally a bit later. John also mentioned that's actually true. You can, of course, also like 503s, similar to like custom 404s, etc. You can, of course, have like a nice, properly looking kind of error page that kind of informs or keeps people informed. Make sure that you obviously host, if you need any of those assets there, that you host them separately. Otherwise, if the server doesn't respond, then you'll probably again have a broken error page, which I've seen once or twice, which is a bit wild. So yeah, but yeah, 503 is really interesting for this type of like maintenance, unavailability, scheduled downtimes, outages, etc. Yeah, there was another tweet from our good friend Gabe, where kind of he's gone back and some kind of back and forth with John, saying, well, look, like, the final switch of mobile first indexing, or mobile only, as Mike called it, it's going to be there, but it's like Google is planning on spreading things out a little bit, kind of when moving the remaining sites. So it's not going to be like, this is it, everything at once, as originally it had been announced. So yeah, we're getting there, but it's not there. It's not done yet. Just keep it in mind. Even if you haven't been switched over, then you don't worry. You're still fine, right? There is this is a big shout out to a really cool event, actually. So conference in the US called Tech SEO Boost. It's going to be happening 22nd of April. And it's going to be free. So that's why I thought it would be really worthwhile sharing it here. It's solely focused on technical SEO stuff. It's a mini conference, so it's not crazy amounts of sessions, but like very specific. As you can see here, this is what we've got. Like tagging and tracking through the server, like a Python panel, some rendering strategies. We're going to talk about Core Web Vitals. Yes, please. We're going to be talking about Core Web Vitals in a bit. It's going to be a session that I really look forward to around like SEO experimentation. As you all know, we kind of run our own Peak A's labs, which is like a topic very close to my heart, which is, I think, super exciting. Then there's going to be one like a panel on tech SEO for like I think the wider audience and especially like larger companies, etc. So yeah, it's a short one, but it looks quite cool, quite intense. So go and sign up. As I've been saying, it's free, 22nd of April. Another topic which I think a lot of us are currently busy with is hiring, which I think is a good sign. Like after a pandemic, obviously, this is actually a very good sign. And I mean, again, I know that of course some companies, still struggle, still face challenges, and I kind of can see that. But I also see on the other hand, for us, like we have, I don't know, 30-ish plus job openings. We can't hire at the pace that we would need to. So if any one of you watching this later is kind of looking for a new challenge, SEO, PPC, tech SEO, content marketing, whatever that is, jobs.pa.ag is where you can find all our openings. If there's something that doesn't fit, or you don't find what's kind of in your area of interest, like drop us a line. Again, there's so many openings right now. chances are very high that we actually have something for you, as long as it's somewhat in digital. And even that, we have some lesser digital ones open as well. Yeah. So anyhow, there's a quite interesting article on interview questions for like how to hire tech SEOs, and kind of, I'm not so overly kind of keen on this like job ad found, etc., but like some interesting kind of thoughts and ideas around the process, and this I found quite inspiring actually. It's like more, kind of questions that you could potentially ask. Again, keep in mind this of course needs to be tailored to what you're looking for specifically, as kind of when you build out a team, your company, especially also your corporate values potentially, how does that person specifically fit in. But like there's some good ideas on like, tech SEO questions, process and problem solving, etc. So it's it's really good. It's really good kind of as an inspiration if you kind of looking for like, what question should I be asking? Potentially you start building out your very first like SEO team, or you moved recently in-house and you've been tasked to build out this team. So I think this is also where this originally came from. Quite an interesting read to get some inspiration. Yeah, more pop-ups. Right, so another great article that kind of happened to appear on SEJ, so our friends over in the US, by Christina Azarenko, is basically kind of a best practice, or some best practices, let's put it that way, on JavaScript SEO. Again, one of the like big topics that like in any of the tech SEO workshops I do is part of the agenda. Usually we spend at least kind of an hour and a half on like the more generic things. I mean, you could easily fill a day or two, and maybe you're not even done then. But like to kind of give people a rough idea of what are the kind of complexities, right? And why is that so different from let's say the kind of unrendered markup when you look at something that has anything to do with JavaScript. And Christina built like a pretty big a guide here on like outlining the things that are that oftentimes happen or can happen when JavaScript is involved, and you're not aware of that, right? So stuff that's not crawlable anymore, or certain other cases, lazy loading not done properly. You should be doing this natively these days, right? Etc. Wrong choice of a front end framework with kind of when you were not considering, or that kind of team wasn't considering SEO implications, etc. So yeah, it's worthwhile going through it. It also explains a bit on like server side rendering, some of the tools that you can use, especially when you're kind of like on a smaller budget, to just get a bit of an understanding, some extensions, etc. So yeah. Certainly worthwhile having a read if you're new to the topic. It's kind of an entry beginner's level thing. If you're not so much into it, if you're already into it, then I would recommend to check out the guide that Only put together. It's actually a bit older, so this is why I don't have the link in here. And then there is one other guide that I was thinking to recommend, but I just can't recall what it was. I think I saw it on ContentKing as well. So like they also have a guide on JavaScript SEO. So yeah, those two. If you're looking for something a bit deeper, then that's worthwhile. But yeah, certainly a good read. Moving on to another guide, our friend Paddy Mugen did one, who is the co-founder of Ira. Kind of used to work with those guys from time to time as well, on like joint international campaigns, and he put together like the beginner's guide to link building, which is like a huge thing, more into Dominique's turf really, but yeah, it's certainly worth it kind of talks about everything and anything that you would need to know: types of links, structuring campaigns, audiences, outreach tactics, measurement, and so on and so forth. So we're not going to go into this, but yeah, if you are looking for some guidance on off-page work, that's definitely one to consider. Freshly released, so go check it out. One that came out earlier this week by Tom Critchlow, who used to run Distilled, UK-based SEO agency before they actually got, I think, acquired by Brain Labs last year. And he's kind of, that was a funny headline that kind of caught my attention, and that reads like, how to turn your agency into the McKinsey of SEO. And yeah, it's quite a thought-provoking article, and I think it's a long one, so it's obviously more tailored to kind of the agency folks watching this one, for sure. But I think what it is more than anything is just kind of talking a lot around structure and processes and these types of things, right? So we are actually working quite a lot with McKinsey, which made me also probably why I kind of got a bit interested in it. And of course, I can't like publicly comment on the stuff here, but I think also like Tom shared a bit of his experience that he has worked with them in the past as well. And I think it's a quite interesting read in terms of like, if you were building out processes and structure. And what I really liked about this is, because that's also a huge part of like what we do at Peak Ace, and what we really care about is kind of development of staff, and outlining very clear paths as how can you move from or how will you be able to move from your traineeship to become a junior, to become a manager, a senior, what are your career path options after that, etc., but not in a kind of like we do it along the way type of thing, which is I think the most common thing. If you look at especially like the agency world, of course there's always lots of things to do, and unfortunately a lot of the agency founders or CEOs or whatever kind of I think make the grave mistake of like prioritizing that over developing stuff. And I think one of the things that we early on decided on was that that's not how we wanted to do it. And so like this is why we build out Peak Ace Academy, where there's kind of a predefined like time and whatever you can think of for like self education, like, but not only that, but also like structured education in general, like etc., right? And I think this is also one thing that McKinsey really obsesses about, is how to kind of develop like their staff on projects. And I think Tom had some really interesting kind of examples as to like how they do it and what that means and what you can learn from it as for your agency. So like a really, really cool thing. Another thing that I found interesting, I never thought about it in that way, but like for us, it's quite clear that we don't want kind of our let's say more junior staff to not work directly on clients and not deliver directly to clients. I think this is not the approach that any agency should have, but he is right, I think, in trying to differentiate that oftentimes when you have like agencies that more kind of on the other hand of the spectrum, like they have the delivery tailored around like some of the senior staff and like the juniors would never see any kind of client interaction, which I think is a bit sad also, like because then you can't, as a person, you can't develop those skills. So you will never be like this well-rounded, you will never have this well-rounded profile. So like I think also one of the things that he mentions here that McKinsey does a lot, and I would kind of strongly agree with that. If you want to like educate and like kind of enable your people to grow, then you shouldn't prevent that, right? It's just like there's no sense in doing that. So there's a lot of like really interesting things in here. It's a relatively long article. Also like a part of marketing, obviously, and etc. So it's a really cool article worth reading, how to turn your agency into the McKinsey of SEO. Google is also busy with a lot of different things, obviously, and this is not an April's kind of full joke-ish thing, but there's a huge guide that they put out on web.dev, debugging web vitals in the field. There was huge debates and questions and whatnot around like Martin's session. Martin Split spoke at Asynix Munich, and like, of course, he talked about core web vitals. And one of the major questions, and I think also equally frustrations of people, is that, like, they don't really fully understand why, let's say kind of you measure twice and you have different numbers. You measure 5 times and you have 5 times different numbers. You measure on different devices and you have different numbers. You measure in different ways and you have different numbers. So like there's huge confusion around this topic, and it's kind of like, sometimes people forget that there's lab data and there's field data, right? So lab data is kind of this where you have Lighthouse, simulated environment, predefined connection speed, etc. Then you have Crux data, which is real data from Chrome on like an aggregate level. That's what you see in a PSI or in GSC, etc. Right? So like there's all different types of sources, different types of how data is being collected, different types of how like data is being aggregated, and it's just like it's a mess. That's very true. And then also like you rerun on the exact same setup, and then you get different numbers, and people are like, why? And what people oftentimes tend to forget is that there's still stuff, even if you don't change the settings, right? That let's say your connection speed that can vary. For example, this server responding can be on a higher load than it was like 10 seconds ago. So therefore it might respond just slower because your process has been parked for like 0.5 seconds. So there's a lot of stuff that even with kind of field data testing, that still is varying. So yeah, there's a guide that Phil Walton put together on like measuring and testing and different types of like how to do it and why to do it and what are the pros and cons, etc. So yeah, worthwhile if you are still like trying to kind of get your head around it. Like there's a huge section on how to track it in GA. There's like various tools and how they measure it. I think one thing worth mentioning here is that I think Martin said at SMX as well that there's likely to come a change rather sooner than later on CLS, like the layout shift scoring, which kind of people are getting really frustrated about. There's some things that don't make that much sense. So the way they measure CLS is gonna change rather sooner than later, so worthwhile keeping an eye on. Then speaking of web performance some more, there is a nice article by Rachel Anderson on the deepcrawl blog, where she's kind of walking you through some of the kind of templates that they're using and kind of the data that they're kind of getting in as to build like dashboards that are somewhat providing, I would say, like a more high level overview of things on like, again, core web vitals, but you can of course also kind of get other stuff in there, Crux data, and then kind of a like really hands-on guide by using this template as a basis and how to do it if you're not familiar with it. I think this is worth having something. Is better than having nothing. So I would kind of strongly recommend if you're a bit maybe late to the game, or you haven't had the time to kind of get your head around, or whatever reason it might have been, this is definitely worth investigating and checking it out. And whilst you're at it, this is another fantastic one that the guys at ContentKing put out. So definitely worth kind of investigating as well. Is the ultimate guide to core web vitals. They released that, and this is basically, well, kind of a very hands-on, as you kind of probably are familiar with their guides. Very hands-on approach to what are core web vitals, in detail, how to measure, etc., etc., etc. So it gives a good idea if you're not familiar with it, or if you have specific questions. I could also like point you to our slide share. There's like, and also some of the previous episodes on like core web vitals, because there's a bunch of things on web performance that I spoke about a couple of times in the past. If you want the decks, please by all means feel free to reach out. We're kind of very happy to share them. No problem there. And I think this is already pretty much it. So we've got in time 40 minutes, but a ton of links. So I hope you found some of the stuff worthwhile. Feel free to kind of, as always, drop your comments or any questions that kind of might come up afterwards. That's I'm gonna pick them up for the next episode. So since there's no one here that I can bug with other questions, I think we're just gonna end this one in time for a change, which is also good. And I'm gonna see you guys next week on Tuesday, 4 p.m. as always, German time, even with the change of summertime. Still, it's gonna be the same day, same time. Wishing you all a fantastic rest of the week, and until next week, bye bye.